Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Professor Leon Blevins of El Paso Community College Television. I've been doing this show since about 2007, if I remember, and over the years I've had some extremely interesting guests. Just a little over a week ago, one of the persons that I'm taking a computer class with, he's another member of that computer class, and he said to me that he had just watched a previous program of ours, but he said, you know, the most interesting program I remember watching on your show, and I said, what was that? And he said, that one with Mr. Morales talking about South El Paso. I said, of all things, because I have Fred Morales with me. And Fred, welcome back to the show.
It's my honor. It's a great privilege to be here.
Okay, and that was several years ago that we did that interview with you, and we talked some about the Mexican Revolution and Segundo Barrio. And here we are bringing it up again. You have a new book about
the Segundo Barrio.
Segundo Barrio.
It's a chronology, and it's my first volume, and it covers the period from the year 1800 to 1920. So it's the early part of the Segundo Barrio, which has had several different names. At first it was called the Bosque, and then it was called the Second Ward, and then Chihuahuita for about 40 years, and then finally the Segundo Barrio by the late 1930s.
Were you born in that area? Did you live in your early years in that area?
I grew up in my early years in Chihuahuita, the Segundo Barrio, and the Union Plaza district.
Mm-hmm. Where do you live now? Which part of El Paso?
I live in the Austin Terrace Historic District. I've lived there for a total of 15 years.
Well, the reason I'm mentioning that on this show is because you don't spend a lot of time at home. You spend a lot of time in the library.
Yes, that's my second home, as I like to call it. I've been going through microfilm through the Lone Star newspaper, the El Paso Herald, and the El Paso Times, primarily year by year, month by month, day by day.
Okay, and I see you there occasionally, and you must spend a lot of money on copying materials there.
Yes.
And because you have some of the pictures of old El Paso in your volumes, and I've read a few of your volumes. And you sell them out of your home, right? You sell them out of your home?
I self-publish my own books. My chronology on the Segundo Barrio is my 35th book. Okay. And I do my own books, and I deliver them to people's homes or business.
We need you to give a telephone number or email address, or both, so people can contact you.
It's 307-3748.
Okay, so that's your phone number. And then let's talk about the primary focus here, of course, at this part of the show. The first half of the show, we want to talk about the Segundo Barrio primarily. What about that? You heard all about its history when you were growing up there as a child, right?
Yes. Well, I've traced old land grants that go back to South El Paso. They start at least in the 1820s. And then one was given in 1834 to Santiago Alvarado.
So these were Spanish land grants?
They were Mexican land grants.
Mexican land grants,
yes.
Okay.
And the Santiago Alvarado land grant went all the way to the Supreme Court in a famous decision called the Water Case. And that would also lead to another international boundary dispute called the Chamizal dispute later.
Okay. Well, then tell me your perception of that area when you were growing up there. I assume you went around the downtown plaza. That was your haunt, that part of town. What did you think about that, being raised in that part of town so close to the Mexican border? And I assume you have a lot of relatives over in Mexico.
Yes, it's a border community. It encompasses the area from El Paso Street to Cotton and from the river to Paisano Street. It became the Second Ward around 1886. It's been known as South El Paso, the South Side, or the Mexican Quarter. When I grew up in that part of town, primarily along 7th Street, you had Aoy School, Alamo School, you had Sacred Heart Church, St. Ignacio Church, you had the Boys Club, the Arminjo Community Center. Mm-hmm. Father Ram had started the Our Lady's Youth Center, and other churches were also involved in creating soup kitchens to feed the needy.
Who were some of the most famous people in history, El Paso history, American history, that lived in that area at one time or frequented that area? I know Pancho Villa came there from time to time.
Pancho Villa worked in the Segundo Barrio in 1919, cleaning pens for roosters to use in cockfights in Juarez. We had Raymond Tellez, who was a mayor, Cleofas Calleros, a historian, and the most decorated World War I soldier, even surpassing the medal count of the famous Sergeant York. We had Marcelino Serna, and he resided in South El Paso.
Okay. Now, tell me about some of the most historic buildings there. Seems like you've given some walking tours. I've been on some of your walking tours and some events there. And I think you mentioned at one house there was a very famous woman who lived there and had a great impact on South El Paso.
Probably that was Teresa Urea on
There it is.
Oregon and 3rd Street. But the most oldest and historical building to me in South El Paso is the old Douglas School. It went back to the 1880s. It was first a church, then the school for the colored, and then later the Knights of Columbus moved in. It was part of Lydia Patterson Institute, and then Father Ram created Our Lady's Youth Center there. We have the Colon Theater on El Paso Street. We also have Bowie High School, which is a tradition in the barrio. It goes all the way back to 1922. And we also had industries there like Derbyshire Ironworks. We had the Union Brass Company, the El Paso Milling Company, and Farah Manufacturing Company. They served as a labor pool for South El Paso residents.
Now, in writing this material on Segundo Barrio, what was the easiest section to write and the hardest section to write in research?
Well, when I do research, it's going to be easy sometimes and hard sometimes to find what you're searching for. But I had a hard time trying to find out an old historical building that served as a custom house starting in 1882. And that became the Ladies' Hospital, and that also became the location of Aoy Elementary School. And then later, when that building was demolished, Flipper, Ocean Flipper, the first Negro graduate of West Point, resided in that two-story tenement that's now there on Oregon and 3rd Street, and that was a Negro colony. Around the 400 block of South Oregon, that was the southern end of Chinatown, and you had a Negro community living together close by, side by side.
A multicultural neighborhood, really.
Yes. You had a Chinese theater, a Chinese Masonic home, and a lodging house run by Dan Daniels for blacks.
Now, all of that got changed by, say, the railroad coming through downtown, the interstate coming through downtown, transportation. I remember the bridge going over into Mexico, the Black Bridge.
Yes.
These were part of the story of that part of town. You want to tell us any about the transportation of that area?
The Chamizal dispute did away with some of these railroad tracks, but South El Paso had tracks to serve the Texas and Pacific. One that went all the way to New Mexico to serve White Oaks. We also had the El Paso Southern Railway. They had their terminex right there on Mesa and 6th Street. And you also had the Santa Fe Railroad going in there with their tracks. And of course, you had railroad bridges, the Mexican Central Bridge, the Mexican Northwestern, and you had the pedestrian bridges of the Stanton and the Santa Fe International Bridges.
Okay. What were your youthful experiences of going across the bridge to Juarez and seeing your relatives and then coming back? It was an open border. Now that we're talking about presidential administration wanting to build more fences and stop that, doesn't that change the complexion of a whole community?
Well, yes, Juarez has changed a lot. When I was a kid, I used to go see wrestling matches over there, lucha libre, as they call it. I used to go swimming. They had a popular swimming pool at La Cerveceria. And a lot of us, when we were young, we used to go party on Mariscal Street and go eat at certain restaurants, like Cito's was a popular restaurant around northern part of Juarez.
So you just thought of it as, this is my community. It wasn't just this side of the river all the time that you were thinking about.
I know there was an international border between Juarez and El Paso, but to me, it didn't exist. In the old days, there was not a heavy border patrol presence. Anybody could cross legally or illegally. And when I grew up in Chihuahuita, I saw thousands of legal and illegal immigrants cross through there. It was the largest crossing point along the U.S.-Mexico border at one time.
Okay. We're going to try to divide this program into two parts, and maybe we'll come back with a summary and knit these together. I asked you a question about transportation. Now let's talk about this one, the Union Plaza District. And so here we have the cover of this, and you did a lot of research. This is thick, okay? The Union Plaza District. I remember it was like 2006. I was down there for the 100th anniversary of the depot, the Union Depot. I was dressed as a sheriff of old El Paso. One of my former students was there. Her mother had been a Harvey girl working in a restaurant, the Harvey restaurant, inside that building. So what caused you to decide to write about this?
Well, I lived in the Union Plaza district on 513 West San Antonio when I got married. I went to the old Franklin School, my beloved school, and for many hundreds of other students. My wife's grandmother owned the Mansion Hotel. I used to hang around with the homeboys on Leon Street around the 1970s and 1980s, and I sponsored a baseball team for them, and we did beautification projects. I know that part of El Paso had a rich, diverse history, so I thought I would write about it.
Oh my goodness. Now, again, you're going through all of the archives that you can find, the photographs and all that. What was most impressive that you found out about the history of this building?
Well, it was built in 1906 by Frank Powers. It was designed by a Chicago architectural firm, and thousands of people went to the dedication of the Union Depot in 1906, and it served several railroads in the beginning. And later it was discontinued, and nowadays we only have Amtrak service.
Yeah, I've gone out of there, well, actually come back through here on Amtrak service and taken a couple of Amtrak trips. When you were growing up and the railroad was here, did you think about places outside you would like to get on that train and go somewhere?
Yes, and I did get the opportunity. When I was a kid, they used to have trains to transport children to go visit Fort Bliss on certain days of the year. And that was an experience that I'll never forget. And I took the train from the Union Depot to Fort Bliss.
Well, you even remember the streetcars. I remember going over the streetcars many years ago, and now they're building a streetcar from downtown, a rail from downtown to UTEP. What was your experiences about riding the streetcars?
Well, it's a great experience. I lived on Santa Fe Street as a kid, and it would always make a turn around my house on a street called Short, and later renamed Chamizal Court. But the Union Depot also had its own trolley service. It was called the Depot Line, and it ran on San Francisco Street, and then it came down on Overland Street.
Oh my goodness.
But that's the Union Depot is an important area when it comes to transportation history. The Baton Tunnel was dedicated in 1950. We had a lot of car dealers in that neighborhood, the Lone Star, the Buick, Chalmers Motor Company. They sold a lot of automobile trucks to Pancho Villa, and they even sold a Buick car to General John J. Pershing when he used during the punitive expedition.
Oh my, and he lived in a building, a house out at Fort Bliss.
Yes, on Sheridan Road.
Yeah, that's right. Now let me raise the issue of discrimination. I remember one time seeing up on the wall, well, in Union Depot, a room there that was for colored only.
Yes.
That's where they put the colored people. They'd buy their tickets to get on the train, and they had to wait there for the train, separate from the others. And that now has been changed. I think they've taken that piece of glass up there down and put an opaque looking piece of glass there instead. Back then, in the period of Jim Crow laws, they called it, we had separate restrooms for men and women, white, colored they called. And then you had drinking fountains that were segregated and so on. And one of the most interesting stories from one of my students years ago was she said that her grandmother and her mother came going to Kansas to meet with relatives to work. And they started to go out to get on in the passenger car, the train, and were told by the conductor they couldn't get on that car. And they said, well, where do we go? And he took them to a boxcar, put them into a boxcar, and they were fed out of sack lunches or something on the way to Kansas. And their restroom was a bucket, one bucket in the boxcar for people to use. And I asked Guadalupe, was her name, is your mother, your grandmother still alive? And she said, yes, my mother's still alive. And I said, what was their reaction to that being discriminated against when they came to the United States? And they said, well, it was horrible. My grandmother and mother talked about how horrible that was, but they're glad they're here because they had opportunities they would not have had in Mexico. You've heard those stories. Were you ever influenced by discrimination in El Paso?
Well, that mostly happened way before I was born.
Oh, that's right. You're a lot younger than I
you know,
am.
they would have signs like no blacks, Mexicans, or dogs allowed here.
Right.
But they used to practice discrimination against Mexican students in the city of El Paso. And in the Union Plaza district, a professor by the name of Olivas Villanueva Aoy set up the first public Mexican school for Mexican pupils. And later that school was renamed Aoy. And at Franklin School, you had discrimination. At first, it was an all-exclusive Anglo school and rich Hispanics. And then by the 1910s, it became a predominantly Mexican student population of mostly destitute pupils.
Hasn't that building been changed into something else now?
No, it got demolished, and they put in a parking garage there on Leon and San Antonio Street. It's where you have the old locomotive inside the old railroad history museum.
Okay. And so you have photographs, I assume, in your works here showing some of these things, right?
Yes. If I might add also, that part of El Paso dates back to a Mexican land grant awarded in 1827 to Juan Maria Ponce de Leon.
Okay.
It's always been known as West El Paso, as the old First Ward in 1886. And in 1849, it was called the Coons Lower Ranch because a man named Coons built mercantile warehouse buildings there for Fort Bliss. And then later was named Smithville. And to me, the word Duranguito was really the name of a gang that roamed that area in the 1950s, but it was never the name of that neighborhood. It's never really had a name of its own until the early 1990s. The city of El Paso decided to do an entertainment district in that part of El Paso, and they labeled it the Union Plaza District.
Okay. And now there's some controversy. We won't get into politics of it, but about where to build a new arena. And so there's discussion about changing some of that if an arena is built there and people will have to move out. What are some of the most historic buildings that are in that particular area, just south of the Civic Center?
Well, on Chihuahua Street, where it intersects with Overland, there's a building there that Judge John Lehigh occupied, and he started the offices for Concordia Cemetery in the early 1880s. And in that building, Michael Dolan, a lawyer and pilot, resided there, and he flew the people or the surrender papers for Pancho Villa to sign in Sabinas, Coahuila in 1920, and he was an Evel Knievel pilot. He actually flew between the towers of the cathedral in Chihuahua City with inches to spare.
Oh my.
On that street, you also have a house where you had the first Jan Cooper Jewish services. I think it was for the Congregation B'nai Zion Jewish Church. And you also had, it was the clothing manufacturing part of the city. You had Man Overall, Heyman Crop. You had Hicks Ponder. And I'm missing another one. Farah Manufacturing actually started there in 1920 with Monsieur Farah. But at first he did shirts, not slack pants. And they were under the Apache brand.
Apache brand.
Yes.
And he got some contracts eventually with the government, if I recall, which helped him expand his business.
Yes.
From shirts to pants and other kinds of apparel.
And the Union Plaza District can brag or boast that they are the only neighborhood in the United States where you had the first meeting between two presidents, of one of the U.S. and one of Mexico, that being Howard Taft and Porfirio Diaz in October 1990.
Yeah, we've seen several pictures of that particular meeting.
And they met inside the interior of the old Chamber of Commerce building on San Francisco Street.
Okay, now what building would you say that has been lost in that area that you would most like to see back?
My old Franklin School.
Franklin School.
Built in 1891, designed by Ernest Krauss. It had a beautiful dome that looked like the domes that you see in St. Peter's Basilica in Moscow. And you don't find that style of architecture no more. And that's where I went for the first grade, me and my wife. And I really had a lot of fond memories. When I was there, I would go across the street to the Franklin Grocery and buy hamburgers and burritos, and then to the Martinez Grocery 1 block away. and buy candies and ice creams.
Well, there's just north of all of that area you've been talking about, the Paso del Norte Hotel. Then became Camino Real, and it's going back to Paso del Norte, I understand. And that was a historic place for people that were trading in cattle
Yes.
and agricultural products and things of that nature. Did you learn a lot about that, about what was happening with regard to cattle going in or coming across or other kinds of things?
Yeah, I've studied that cattle, copper, and cotton have been the major industries in this part of the country. And at the Paso del Norte, you would have a lot of conferences involving cattlemen. Mm-hmm. And the most famous cattle owner in the world stayed there around 1913, and his name was Luis Terrazas from Chihuahua. And he handled millions of cattle, and he transported them primarily to American meat companies.
Okay, and they have a beautiful dome in there. If you go into the bar area and look up, you see this Tiffany-looking glass that is there, yes. And they've been preserving that. One of the things I found out about El Paso and teaching here for so many years is the interesting facts of culture and history, the military, the Native Americans. That gets further down in the valley for another show in its own. But before our time is gone, what are some other highlights that you found in your research that I should know?
Well, the Union Plaza District is a part of El Paso that should not be wiped off the face of the map. It's the third oldest part of the city, and it has its own rich and diverse history. A lot of people like Gilbert Roland, movie star, lived there.
Oh, yeah.
Even Marcelino Serna, World War I hero. And you had other people like John Selman, the slayer of John Wesley Hardin. You had several madams live there. And many contributed to the life in the Union Plaza district. And I've been able to single them out, and through my books that I've written, I've brought them to the forefront. But that part of El Paso goes back to a time when it used to be farm fields. They planted wheat and corn, and they built an acequia through there. It had a tannery, and it had quarters for farm workers when Juan María Ponce de León turned that into one of the first farming areas of what is now El Paso.
Now, what about water and sewage in all of this? I know that one of the first laws of the city council in 1873, when they were incorporated as the city of El Paso or something, is the ditch, bringing water from the Rio Grande River. What about that aspect of South El Paso? That was essential to the people there to have water.
Well, the Segundo Barrio had their own acequia, or irrigation dish, right. And it flowed on 3rd Street. And that water came from other acequias that flowed in downtown. You actually had 3 acequias at one time downtown. But Ponce de León erected the first acequia in the late 1820s, and it was built by Francisco Bernal. And at first, the acequia only went all the way to the county courthouse. And that was a grape field at one time. And then later, it was extended all the way to Concordia Cemetery.
Now, do you have any idea of the dimensions of it, how wide such a ditch was? Or?
Oh, they were very narrow. Our first irrigation ditch was built in the 1680s by the Manso Indians, and it was called the Acequia Madre in Juarez. Mm-hmm. In 1890, the Franklin Canal was constructed in El Paso and built all the way to Fabens for a total of 40 miles.
Okay. Now, I remember years ago when I first started coming to El Paso very much, I was teaching in Deming, go over to Zaragoza, and there was a black ditch, they called it, going to the bridge. It was a narrow bridge, 2 lanes, and it was a sewage disposal, basically. Go down a ways and then dump into the Rio Grande River. And so that was their sewage system, was one ditch for bringing in the water and another ditch for taking it out.
Yes.
But it was absolutely necessary for the population to stay here.
Yeah. They call them aguas negras, or black waters.
Black water, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, goodness gracious. Do people ever wonder how you store all of this stuff in your brain? Do people ask you about that? Fred Morales, how do you know all of this stuff? You read all of this stuff. How do you keep it up here and organize it up here?
Well, they call me a walking encyclopedia.
Oh, yes, you are.
And how do I keep it stored? I keep it active. I try and live a healthy life. And I'm always just stuck reading books or researching. And the only way that it's going to ever stick to anybody's brain is that you keep on rereading and rereading it, so that sooner or later it will become, whenever you need it, it's going to come out.
And what we're doing here, talk about it.
Yes.
Don't just read it, think about it, but talk about it with other people and share your stories. And that's what you are. You're a storyteller. Do you ever run into complications of trying to gather this material? Do any of the people that have the resources say, we don't have time for you to help you to find this material? Or are they very, very helpful?
I do everything on my own. I'm self-educated too. I don't have a master's or PhD in history, and I don't think I need it. I just feel that if you have the passion or to go into anything, in this case history, and you let it endure, it's going to build and build, and you're going to become addicted to it.
Right.
And that's what happened to me.
Does anyone ever give you a problem and say, look, you don't have all this footnoted, where you got all of this stuff? You do mention in here, don't you, under pictures and things, where these come from?
I have my sources. If one wants to inquire about it, I will supply it. But I don't like to put most of my sources, because there are other historians that will come and steal your ideas, and they won't even give you credit. But I never have to worry about what I read or especially write, as long as I can back it up.
Okay. This is called popular history. This is not academic history with all the footnotes and a background. This is popular history.
It's grassroots history.
Yeah, it's grassroots, and it's fun to read. It's easy to read. I've read some of your materials, and it makes it very easy to read. Well, I'm glad that you do know so much, and you can share some of it with us. Look, we just have a 28-minute segment here today, and we just touched the surface. We just floated across the surface. Any last word that you'd like to share with us about El Paso and your adventure here?
Well, this year I'm going to restart my walking tours and my historic exhibits, and I'm going to work on my second volume on the Segundo Barrio that covers the period from 1920 to about 1973. Okay. Then after that, I'm going to write my own book on the Chamizal dispute, because, like, for example, the Chamizal National Memorial has never wanted to recognize Chihuahuita as the birthplace of the Chamizal dispute, and I'm going to go and put it in chronological order and tell how the Chamizal dispute started there in 1814.
Okay, well, very good. Well, you're not going to let any grass grow under your shoes, because you're going to be busy moving along and writing some more stuff for us. Thank you for
You're welcome.
discovering all of this and sharing little bits of it with us today on Perspectives El Paso, Fred. Maybe we'll see you again in the future when you finish that other big section of the work.
Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for watching another program we call Perspectives El Paso, and you just got Fred Morales perspectives on Segundo Barrio and the Union Plaza districts. Thanks for watching. I'm Leon Blevins.